Next, let's take a look at economic changes that were going on in New Mexico during this time period from 1870 up into the early 20th century. Once again, let's take a look at the effect of the railroad this time in New Mexico. By now, you should be getting familiar with this, right? So the railroad comes in, property values start to increase, and then if you're a Mexican American who has lost land or you don't have land at this time, it becomes increasingly difficult for you to be able to purchase land, right? So the railroad raises the price of land. You also again see the growth of the agricultural industry, this time taking place in New Mexico because of the railroad, because those products can be shipped out to other parts of the country now because of the railroad. Before, you couldn't really ship agricultural products to other parts of the country and to other markets, so they were mainly just grown for local markets, meaning that it wasn't a lot of money involved in that agricultural industry. But now that you have markets all over the US, there's a bigger demand, meaning that more money could come in and you could see the growth of the agricultural industry take place. Okay, now it's taking place in New Mexico because of the railroads. Eventually, the cattle industry that had once thrived in New Mexico would start to go into decline because of drought. Remember, when drought occurs, that's going to kill off the grasses that the cattle eat and survive on. So eventually cattle will starve to death, and there goes your cattle industry, right? So drought's horrible for the cattle industry. So that starts to go into decline. The agricultural industry starts to really develop. It's very similar to what took place in California. Okay, and also again, the railroads are going to bring in more and more Anglo-American migrants into New Mexico. Right? Who are these individuals? A lot of them are ex-soldiers who come into the region after the Civil War. Right? They don't have jobs. They're looking for work. Maybe they'll work in the mining industry there in New Mexico. Some of these outlaws were involved in the Lincoln County shooting war. This war involved the taking of land of Mexican Americans as they were intimidated or pushed off their land through violent means. So basically, you had a lot of Anglo-Americans coming into Lincoln County, setting up cattle farms, setting up sheep herding ranches, and basically they were trying to obtain more and more lands. They sent a warning to Mexican Americans that they either leave their land or there's going to be violence, and eventually violence did occur. People were killed, women were raped, lands and property were destroyed, and all of this was to push Mexican Americans off of their land. This was one aspect of the Lincoln County shooting war. There were other aspects, but this is the part that involved Mexican Americans, right? And so you see land loss taking place with the arrival of more and more Anglo-Americans, and you have some of these rough types, these outlaws, taking part in this war at this time. More cases of land loss in New Mexico. The federal government set up the office of the Surveyor General, and the purpose of this office was to judge cases that were all about land claims. Right? And so people would bring their land claims to this office, and the office would make a decision on who owned the land. Okay, so it would settle land disputes. The problem is that the office of the Surveyor General really worked to the disadvantage of Mexican Americans, and there's a number of reasons for this. Number one, no one involved in the office could speak Spanish, and they had no understanding of Mexican law. So how are they going to understand Mexican land grants and be able to see whether they are valid or not? They don't know how to speak Spanish. They can barely even communicate with Mexican Americans who come to bring their land claims to the office. And so right there, that's working against Mexican Americans. Also, the Office of Surveyor General really didn't allow for due process. And so that really worked against Mexican Americans as well, as they received unfair treatment and didn't go through the entire legal process. Sometimes land claims would simply be given to Anglo-Americans before Mexican Americans had the chance to even bring their claims to the office, right? So basically, whoever showed up first and claimed the land, especially if they were Anglo-American, the office would give them rights to that land. right? And then Mexican Americans would come along and they would, try to enforce their land claims, but the office basically wouldn't give them the time of day. So lack of due process going on there. And another problem was that some of the members of the office of the Surveyor General actually had their own personal interests in some of these lands. An example of this would be Henry Atkinson. Atkinson would be involved in judging his own land claims, right? And of course, he's going to be ruling in his own favor, right? And so total corruption taking place in the office of the Surveyor General there in New Mexico, leading to the loss of land for Mexican Americans. Another way the Mexican Americans lost land in New Mexico was through partitioning of community grants. The issue with community grants was that during the Mexican period, when New Mexico was part of Mexico, many communities would be given a land grant, and everyone in the community had equal rights within that land grant, belonged to the whole community, right? That whole piece of land. But when the United States took over, those community grants were broken apart, right? Because there was no actual official deed to show that this community grant belonged to these people. And now this didn't happen instantly. It was a long process of taking these community grants away from Mexican Americans who lived there in those communities. Right, and so when these cases would go to court, sometimes they would take a long period of time. There were high lawyer fees involved, and the lawyers, similar to what happened in California, would end up sometimes getting their pay in the form of land. All right, so imagine this. Imagine that Mexican Americans are going to court trying to show that they have land rights to these community lands, right? And they have to hire a lawyer. And his fee is very high, and they don't have the money to pay for his fee. And so after the case is over, they have to pay their lawyer with land instead of money. And so they're losing their land to these types of lawyers. An example of one of these lawyers is Thomas B. Catron. Here's a picture of Catron. So Catron would represent Mexican Americans, and then they would have to pay him in land. He ended up amassing millions of acres of land in this process. An example would be the Tierra Amarilla grant. This is a land grant. 600,000 acres of land that he received in this land grant. And so this is another way that Mexican Americans were losing land in New Mexico, right? We go over land loss so much in these different regions because you got to understand the process of how after the Mexican-American War, you had Mexican Americans who owned a lot of land in those regions, right? They were the dominant population, but it took time, and over time, they lost these lands. And so that's why we're going over all these different examples of how land was lost, right? So you got to know specifically how it was lost, right? So through corrupt federal offices like the Office of the Surveyor General, right? Through lawyer fees, and that happened in California as well, right? People paying with land. Still on the subject of land loss in New Mexico, let's take a look at some resistance by Mexican Americans to the attempted taking of their land, all right? Okay, so in New Mexico, there was something called the Santa Fe Ring. What is that? Well, the Santa Fe Ring was basically a bunch of prominent individuals. You have businessmen, you have officials that work for the territorial government, judges, all these type of prominent individuals were involved in what was called the Santa Fe Ring. And part of what the Santa Fe Ring was involved in was the taking of land, right? They were trying to get land, and a lot of times it was done through illegal activity. Right? And so you have a lot of these high-profile individuals connected to each other in this Santa Fe Ring, trying to obtain land, and many times from Mexican Americans, right? Eventually, Mexican Americans would organize and start to protest against the corruption of the Santa Fe Ring. One of these protests took place in Las Vegas, New Mexico in 1884. And eventually, the federal government would create a court of land claims to try to stop all of this corruption, and the Santa Fe Ring would eventually be broken up. right? And they would lose their influence. Now, in Las Vegas, there was an issue over land that took place, a particular piece of land called the Las Vegas Land Grant. This grant of land was pretty large. It was about 500,000 acres, and it was used by Mexican Americans for grazing their cattle, getting access to water. It's a large piece of land, right? And it was used by various different community members. Well, Anglo-Americans came into the territory and started to claim parts of the Las Vegas land grant. They began to build fences that would keep out Mexican Americans from using the land. Mexican Americans came together and started to resist these actions because the court case involving the Las Vegas land grant was still in process, right? So it wasn't determined who owned that land grant yet. It was still in court. And so these Anglo-Americans did not have the right to start building fences there because the case was still in court. And so Mexican Americans start to fight back against all of this fence building by Anglo-Americans on the Las Vegas land grant. Eventually, Juan Jose Herrera and his two brothers would form an organization that would include hundreds of Mexican Americans in the region, and this organization was known as Las Gorras Blancas. And Las Gorras Blancas basically was an organization that was secret. Many of its members wore masks, and what they did was they would go and cut the fences that Anglo-Americans had built on the Las Vegas land grant, right? So that Mexican Americans could still have access to the land, they could graze their cattle there, etc. And so Las Gorras Blancas played an important role in stopping Anglo-Americans from taking over that land, right? And it was, through illegal activity, but still this is a form of resistance by Mexican Americans to maintain their access to land during a time when Anglo-Americans were trying to take it over.